Hello, and welcome to another lesson from our series out of Matthew's Gospel. This series we've entitled, Listen to the Messiah. We have previously established that we believe, tradition tells us, that Matthew's Gospel was written by Matthew, formerly known as Levi, a Jewish tax collector, who, when called by Jesus, left his tax collecting table and became a disciple and was named by Jesus as one of the 12 apostles. He writes his account of Jesus' ministry and teachings from a very definite Jewish perspective. In a prior lesson, we looked at chapters 5, 6, and 7 as a whole, the passage that we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And we made the observation that many people believe those three chapters are not really one sermon preached in one setting to one group of people, but rather is a sermon or is a compilation of sermons that Jesus preached in many different places at many different times to many different peoples, and Matthew simply compiles them all around the one instance where he did teach his disciples aspects of kingdom living. Today, we want to look at one passage from that Sermon on the Mount, and then we want to look at a passage from Jesus' teaching in the temple during Holy Week, after the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday, but before the crucifixion. What we see here is that the same theme is in both passages, and this is why many people believe that the Sermon on the Mount is a compilation, because Jesus went from village to village saying, repent, the kingdom of heaven is here, and giving them instructions, and there are certain themes that he repeated over and over and over again. And the lesson today is on the theme of hypocrisy. The title of the lesson is A Warning Against Hypocrisy. And we're going to see that in two separate passages, chapter 7, chapter 23, Jesus addresses this theme. So let's begin in chapter 7, and let me read verses 1 through 5. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. He starts there in chapter 7, verse 1, with the admonition, do not judge. Now the word judge, Greek word translated into English as judge, can have several different meanings. To condemn, to criticize, to find fault with. Those are rather negative. To evaluate, to decide, to distinguish, to select, to separate. Those are a little more generic and don't necessarily carry with them harsh considerations. For example, you judge the apple pie contest. You select which one's the best apple pie. That's not a harsh criticism, whereas somebody finding fault with somebody and tell them they're wrong and they did this and they did that, that's got the negative consequence. So you have to look at the context in which the word is used to determine whether you're talking about the judge in a negative sense or to judge in a more general sense. And that's what we need to do with our passage here today. In chapter 7, verse 1, he says, do not judge, and the motivation, the reason you shouldn't judge, because if you do, you will be judged. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. It seems like then we're talking about something negative here. You want to avoid the negative. So it seems that using this word judge the first time, he's talking about the idea of criticize, find fault with, condemn. Do not find fault with, condemn, criticize other people, or you too will have one calling you, criticizing you, etc. But it's interesting to note that he says, or you too will be judged. Now, there's a difference in those verbs. The judge, do not judge, is in the present tense. Present, ongoing, continuous action. The judged, second time, used in that second time in the passage, is in the future tense and in the passive voice. Now what that means is that when he says, you too will be judged, it's talking about something that will happen in the future tense, and it will be done by another person or someone else, passive voice. Passive voice suggests that there is a third party or another party that is the subject of the verb judge. Well, who is that subject? Well, we can read this two ways. One is, you will be judged, talking about God, final judgment. He will judge you. You go around and you're harsh and critical of people, you will be judged accordingly. The other is in this life. Other people will judge you. You're harsh, critical, again, as to other people, that their relationship will be the same with you. They will have a tendency to be harsh and critical with you. So when he says, do not judge, or you too will be judged, he's saying, be generous, be gracious, be accepting, be open with people. Don't go around being critical, negative, condemning, because if you are, they'll treat you the same way, and there's a negative judgment coming from God. Now, Barclay, the commentator of the last century, Barclay says that this theme of how you treated other people was a frequent theme amongst the rabbis. The rabbis wrote and frequently discussed that it was important that you be nice to other people. Barclay wrote this, many a time the rabbis warned against judging others. He who judges his neighbors favorably, they say, will be judged favorably by God. That was a teaching of the rabbis. Now, the rabbis taught that there were 6 great works that brought man credit in this world and profit in the world to come. That is, that fostered good relationships in this world and was found to be favorable with God. And here are those 6 great works: study, visiting the sick, hospitality, devotion and prayer, education of children in the law, and thinking the best of other people. So one of these 6 great works is what Jesus is talking about. Do not judge. Instead, think the best of other people. Think the best of other people. If you don't, you will be judged by God and by others. So this is the motivation. Do not judge, for someone else, others, and God will judge you in the same way. The fact that Jesus brings this up indicates that this was going on and helps us understand this is very much a part of our human nature as contrasted with that transformed nature once we have a relationship with Jesus Christ. The human nature tends to be judgmental, critical. Why? Because they're seeing everything and everybody through their own eyes. They're seeing everything and everybody through what's good for me, and the way I can be built up is to tear you down. So Jesus recognizes this is a part of the human nature. He recognizes this is something that even his people who are following him need to understand. And so he says, do not judge, or you will be judged. Now, the word judge in verse 2, he says, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. In verse 2, the word judge here is probably used in the broader sense. Verse 1, he was talking about negative sense. Verse 2 seems to be using judge in the broader sense. He says, for in the same way you judge, if you judge in the positive sense, that's the way you'll be judged. If you judge in the negative sense, that's the way you will be judged. For in the same way you are judged. Now, the Greek wording there, in the same way, that phrase, in the same way, is basically saying this is the criteria that you'll be judged by. The same criteria you use to judge is the criteria you will be judged by. Now, the word criteria in the Greek comes from the same root word as the word judge in the Greek. So this is the basis for your judgment. In the same way, the same criteria, the same basis that you use for judging, that's the basis others will use in judging you. And then he illustrates this. He illustrates this idea that the same way you judge is the same way that you will be judged by referring to the measure. Now, this refers to a situation that we're not quite as familiar with. In the marketplace of that day, the merchant would have raw product that he would be selling, and there would be a price set for a certain amount. But how do we know when we have that amount? Well, you had to have a measure to measure that amount. So if it was a pound, you would have a weight. You'd put the weight, a pound weight on one side of the scales, and you'd put the product on the other side of the scales, and when you got them balanced, we'd know that was the proper amount that should be sold for the amount that was stated. If it was something that needed to be measured in volume, there would be a container. And the container, when you get X amount for this amount of money, you fill the container up with it, and that would give you the amount that you have purchased. Well, it was understood by most that many of the merchants were dishonest, and they actually had two sets of measures. They had one, if it was a weight, it was lighter, or if it was a container, it'd be a little smaller. So when they told you they're selling you $5 worth of wheat, you didn't get $5 worth of wheat because they measured it out with a lighter weight. You're supposed to get X number of pounds or X number of bushels, and they had a smaller container or a lighter weight. And that was a way to deceive you. That was a way to make money off of you. And so the listeners to Jesus' teaching here would have understood that when the merchant gets ready to make a transaction, he has the choice. He can use the honest measure, or he can use the smaller or lighter measure. And it is this choosing between measures decision that Jesus is referring to here. He says, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. If you choose to be dishonest, to choose the lighter measure, that's the measure that's going to be chosen when you are judged, when you receive your side of the transaction. So he's talking about the same way. You choose the criteria you choose to measure other people. Critical, harsh, generous, accepting. Or, and this is the essence of the problem, self-centeredness. Jesus knew that in the human nature we see everything through the lens of self. And one of the ways to build me up is to put you down. The worse you look, the better I look. So there is this temptation to see people through self and to be critical and harsh and judgmental because that makes me look good. And Jesus says, in the same way you judge people, you will be judged by others and by God. Jesus says the same measure you use when judging others is going to be used when you're judged. If you're harsh, critical, negative, that's the way you can expect people to respond to you. And God sees that you are self-centered, and that is a negative consequence. What we're talking about is perspective. What is your perspective on people? From the human, self, self-centeredness, or from this transformed life wherein, after a relationship with Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit lives in us, and we see people and we're able to respond to them in openness and love and kindness. If we look for the bad in everybody, we can expect people to look for the bad in us. But if we're looking for the good, remember, we don't know what all they've been through. Jesus gives a graphic illustration now about this idea of attempting to help other people when we are in need of help ourselves. And this is going to the picture, the story about the speck of sawdust and the plank. Listen what he says. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Okay, this is the idea of judging someone else's acts. You look at them and you find the smallest little thing, a speck of sawdust in his eye. You find something very small with them that's wrong, and you make a big deal out of it. But at the same time, he's got a speck of sawdust, you've got a big piece of lumber. In fact, one writer said, it's like the beam used to support a roof in your eye. You're willing to point out the tiniest little negative thing about him, ignoring the major negatives of your own life. That's hypocrisy. And that's what Jesus is saying. Don't judge others. You need to take care of self first. So he says, why are you so concerned about the smallest speck of sawdust in someone else's eye, and pay no attention to your own eye? Then he says, how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when at the same time there's a plank in your own eye? Now, here's the issue. If you've got, now obviously this is hyperbole, this is exaggeration for the graphic impact. But if you've got a piece of wood in your eye, how can you even see to find the speck in someone else's eye, much less be able to go into that eye and pick it out? So he's saying, when you start judging other people, when you've got things that you need to deal with, you're in no condition to be making those kinds of judgment. It's hypocritical to say, I can help you remove that small speck of sawdust when I've got this big plank in my own eye. In other words, you need to address the planks in your eye first. You need to address your own situation before you go judging and condemning other people. Barclay says there are several reasons why we should not be judging or criticize other people. First of all, he says we don't know all the facts that the other person's been through. We don't know what the situations are. We don't know what their background is. We don't know what they're dealing with. And for us to be critical of something they've done, we don't know the whole background. Secondly, he wrote this, the fact is that if we realize what some people have gone through, so far from condemning them, we would be amazed at how they have succeeded as being as good as they are. Our task is not to condemn and to judge by superficial unloveliness, but to look for the underlying beauty. That is what we have to have others, that is what we would have others to do to us. That is what we must do to them. We want other people to be considerate and understand where we're coming from. We need to give them that same understanding. Second reason Barclay says we ought not to judge other people, be looking at the speck in their eye. He says it's impossible it is impossible to be impartial. We are looking at them through human lens. We see things through our own perspective. Barclay wrote, only a completely impartial person has the right to judge. It is not in the human nature to be completely impartial. Only God can judge. We have certain prejudices and certain predilections, and we shouldn't be imposing those on other people. The third reason he said that we should not judge, he says, no one is good enough to criticize others. We all have, if not a plank, at least a speck, and we need to pay more attention to that. We have quite enough to do to rectify our own lives, Barclay wrote, without seeking censoriously to rectify the lives of others. we would do well to concentrate on our own faults and to leave the faults of others to God. Do not judge, or you'll be judged. The same way you judge, others will judge you. How can you possibly say to someone, let me help you with the speck in your eye, when you've got a plank in your own eye? Jesus said, when you act like this, you're being a hypocrite. You're playing to be somebody that you're not. Well, let's look over to chapter 23. As I said earlier, chapter 23 picks up in Holy Week. They've already had the Palm Sunday entry into the city, and Jesus is in the temple teaching, and we remember that there was a series of challenges placed to him by the Jewish leaders. The Sadducees came and challenged him. The Pharisees challenged him. He's been challenged as to who should, or why do, who gave you the authority, referring to the cleansing of the temple. He's been challenged, should Jews pay taxes to Rome? He's been challenged with the situation of the man who died and his wife married the brother, and he died, she married the next brother, and the Sadducees, who don't even believe in the resurrection, came and said, whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? He's been challenged, what is the greatest commandment of all in the law? Each of these questions were intended to get Jesus to say something that the religious leaders thought would discredit him with the crowds that were listening. So after he's been challenged in all these ways and he successfully answered them, we then get down to chapter 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and his disciples, okay, he's standing there in the temple, the crowds and the disciples are listening. He's been dealing with the Jewish leaders, so I would suggest they're probably in the background. And just what Jesus says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and to be called rabbi by others. Still dealing with this theme of hypocrisy. So here he is in the temple. It's just before we know the crucifixion is coming with just a matter of days. He's teaching, he's been confronted by these Jewish leaders, and now, probably while they're still listening, Jesus makes the statements. And he gives them a warning. And he says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they don't practice what they preach. A warning again to the crowds, to the followers, as to what respect they give to the Pharisees and the scribes, or the teachers of the law. Now, we know a little bit about the Pharisees, and the Pharisees and scribes seems to be a term, a phrase that's used to refer to this group. The Pharisees were very, very committed to the detailed observance of every little bit of the law. They came after the exile, after the Babylonians took the tribe of Judah into exile in Babylon and then allowed them to come back. There was a group that arose from the Babylonian exile and then when they first came back that were very committed to keeping the law, because they said it is our failure to keep the law that caused us to be taken into exile. So they were very, very devoted to keeping every little bit of the Mosaic law. Now the name Pharisee means separated one. And they were saying, we've got to be different. We've got to make sure everybody keeps the law so that we are distinguished from all those round about us. Their duty when they got back to Jerusalem was to teach the law and to make sure everyone understood how to carry out the law. And so what happens after they get back to Jerusalem, until the time of Jesus, they have taken the law and interpreted and interpolated it, and they've come up with thousands of rules that had to be followed so you could keep the general principle of the law. Now, we give a lot of emphasis in our New Testament studies to the Pharisees, but they really were, as compared to the total number of Jews that were alive in Jesus' day, there were not that many Pharisees. There are only about 6,000. About 1,000 Sadducees and about 6,000 Pharisees. But they had such a reputation for keeping the law, and they were and they taught the law, and they taught all these rules, and they were so well known by being able to see them as being different. They had quite a bit of influence with the Jews of Jesus' day. Now, they weren't always received favorably by everyone. In fact, the Talmud is a Jewish writing that are a compilation of writings compiled over a period of times. The Talmud has a description of the Pharisees, and not terms of flattery always. The Talmud says there were 7 different categories of Pharisees. The first type of the Pharisees the Talmud describes was what was called the shoulder Pharisee. He was the one that kept the details of the law, but he did so that he could be seen. He wore his righteousness on his shoulder, on his sleeve. He wanted everybody to see him. So he was very righteous in his outward acts, but it was motivated by pride, motivated by reputation. Then there was a group of Pharisees they called wait a little Pharisees. These were people who called for strict observance of the law by everyone, but they always had an excuse as to why they had not kept the law themselves. They preached one thing, they practiced another. And they would say, well, when this happens, then I'll be able to keep the law. Wait a little while. There was always an excuse. Then there was another group of Pharisees that were called the bruised or bleeding Pharisees. This was a group of Pharisees that can be demonstrated this way, or illustrated this way. They understood, they felt as a matter of principle, that a good, strict, law-observing Jewish male would not speak to a female in public, not even if it was his own wife or daughter. They shouldn't be talking to females in public. So what these Pharisees, the bruised or bleeding Pharisees, what these Pharisees did is as they walked in public, they always kept their head down and their eyes closed. They did not want to so much as even to see a woman in public. If they didn't see her, then there was no one that could accuse them of speaking to her. That was how far they were going to keep what they understood to be the law. And as a result of their walking around with their eyes closed, they bumped into things, they tripped over things, and they were constantly injured, they are constantly bruised. And so these who went to that extreme in keeping the law were called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. Then there was the humpback Pharisees. These were Pharisees who were very, very adamant or very, very aggressive in demonstrating their humility in public. So as a result, when they walked around, they always walked around bent over, stooped over, looking at the ground, refusing to see anybody, refusing to acknowledge anyone, but looking at the ground to show how humble they were. And they didn't even lift their feet. They simply shuffled along in the dust to show how humble they were. They wanted all to see how humble they were. So they were described as the humpback Pharisees. Then there was the ever-reckoning Pharisees. These were the people who were going around counting up who was being obedient and who wasn't, and reckoning righteousness to those who were being obedient and judgment to those who weren't. They were the one that were going around just showing how indebted some people were to God because they weren't being obedient. Then you had the timid Pharisee. This is the one who was so afraid of God's judgment. He viewed God as being an angry, God of wrath who was ready to harshly treat everyone who disobeyed in the least. So their whole obedience was out of fear of this angry God. Then there was what the Talmud called the God-fearing Pharisee. This is the one who really loved God. This is the one who was really trying to be obedient as God instructed. So you see, the Talmud described many different groups of Pharisees, and only one of them was very flattering. And this is what Jesus is saying now. These Pharisees, the good and the bad, these Pharisees, and look what he says. He says, they sit in Moses' seat. What does he mean by that? Well, the Jews of that day understood a continuity in the law. They understood there was a continuity that started with Moses receiving the law. Moses gave the law to Joshua. Once they were settled in the promised land before his death, Joshua gave the law to the elders of the tribes. The elders of the tribes taught their people the law, and sooner or later the prophets came along, and the prophets then took the law, and they preached the law to the people. And of course, the prophets prophesied destruction, destruction came, and then once they came back from exile, the law was given by the prophets to the scribes and the Pharisees. And now for these several hundred years, it has been the scribes and the Pharisees whose job it was to teach the law to the people. So Jesus said, the Pharisees sit in the seat. The Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. There has been this continuity of the law from Moses down to you, and the Pharisees sit in that seat. Now, several centuries after Jesus' death and ascension, there developed a practice in Jewish worship that in the front of the synagogue, they would place a chair and call that Moses' seat. Now, whether that practice had started early enough to be around during Jesus' time, we're not sure. We don't have evidence of that. We're not sure. But what Jesus is saying is, the Pharisees are teaching you the law, and you should listen to them. The essence of what they're teaching you is, in fact, what you need to hear. The metaphor of the seat of Moses is they're the ones who are supposed to be teaching you. So do what they say. Barclay says, insofar as these scribes and Pharisees have taught you the great principles of the law which Moses received from God, you must obey them. Do what they say. Now, Barclay takes this and explains it in a little different term, and I think it helps us to understand. When you think about the Ten Commandments, the rest of the law is based on the Ten Commandments. When you think about the Ten Commandments, you have those commandments that are related specifically to God. And Barclay says the great principle there is reverence God. Then you have those commandments that are related to the relationship between man and man, not kill, not murder, etc. And he says the great principle behind those commandments is respect for other people. Okay, so Barclay would suggest the great principles of the law are reverence for God, respect for other people. What did Jesus say when asked about the greatest of the law? Love the Lord, love your neighbor. Reverence for God, respect for other people. So, in essence, what Jesus is saying, what these Pharisees are teaching you about these principles of the law, you need to listen to. You need to follow them. But what he is also saying is, good theology is not enough. You got to live it out. They might teach the principles, but look at how they're living it. Look at what they've done. What was the problem that's been created? Well, Jesus tells us what has happened. He says, they, speaking of the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the one who are teaching these principles that you need to listen to, he says, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. He said, don't do what they do. Look what they do. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads. Now, we've seen before that the Pharisees took these general principles of the law, made these thousands of rules that became very cumbersome and burdensome. We know about some of those rules. Remember, Jesus got caught, chastised by the religious leaders because his followers picked some grains, some heads of grain from the fields on the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. The rule was you couldn't keep the Sabbath holy if you labored. Well, what is labor? They suggested any time you take and you pick or thresh, and the disciples took those grains of wheat and squeezed them, rubbed them between their hands, and got the kernel broken open to get the grain out, and then they ate it. They said, when you pick and thresh and harvest, that's labor. And they said that was a violation of the Sabbath. This is the cumbersome load. This is the heavy load they put, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. You couldn't labor. Labor meant carrying a load. How much was a load? Well, if it was just a little bit, a load was defined to the point that George Washington could not have worn his false teeth on Sunday, on the Sabbath, because that would be carrying too heavy of a load. Okay, you see how cumbersome this was? And he says, this is what they've done. They do what they say. These great principles, follow them, but don't do what they do, because they've created all of these little rules, and they put them on people, little rules that you couldn't possibly keep them all. And he says they tie them up, cumbersome loads, put them on other people's shoulders, but they don't do a thing. They themselves are not willing to lift a finger to help them. There's never any opportunity for an excuse or any kind of forgiveness. They do nothing to help. They never saw a single justification to relax any of these expectations. They are self-centered. They're keeping the rules for, they are preaching that you've got to keep rules for others. But why do they follow the rules? Not because they love others and they want others to see. They follow these rules because they want other people to see them. They want other people to know how righteous they are. See, what he says is, everything they do is done for people to see. That's their motivation. They have all these thousands of rules, put them on people's back, don't give them any slack, don't do anything to help them, and the whole purpose behind it is so everyone can see how righteous they are. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide. Now, what's a phylactery? You go back over to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, in Exodus 13:9, this will be an observance, this observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that this law of the Lord is to be on your lips. What they would do is they would make small leather boxes, if you will, and tie them to a strap of leather. And in these little leather boxes, the phylactery, they would place Scripture, the law. And then they would tie them to their hands, and they would tie them to their foreheads. They would dangle down between their eyes. And this was to remind them of the law that they should be following and that they should be speaking. And Jesus says, and these Pharisees, they keep the law, they keep the Exodus instruction by making the phylactery, but they make the phylacteries big so everybody will be sure and see it. So people far away would see they're wearing this phylactery hanging down between their eyes or on their hands. They make their phylacteries wide. Then the other thing he says they do is they make the tassel on their garments long. Now what is that getting to? Deuteronomy 22:12 says, make tassels on the four corners of your cloak you wear. And the purpose was so that when you see the tassels, you'll be reminded of God's law. The tassels on the cloak were to be a reminder of God's law. Well, these Pharisees wanted to keep the law, have tassels to remind them of God's law, but they wanted to make sure that everyone else saw that they were keeping the law, so they made long tassels. So no matter how far away you were. When you saw them, if you recognized their cloak, you would see those tassels hanging from the cloak. So it was all done from a motivation of self. They wanted other people to see. Do what they say, but don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they preach. They're practicing everything from this self-centered perspective. Then he says, they love to be greeted with respect. Excuse me, I missed a part there. They loved the place of honor at banquets. Now, in that day and time, when you went to a banquet, you went to someone's home for a dinner, and several people would be there, the seats closest to the host would be the place of honor. In other words, the closest friends, the people that are being honored, would sit closest to the host. And the further you got down away from the table, the less honor that was, from the host, the less honor that was implied in your status there in that community. And he's saying, when they go to a banquet, they want to be right down in the seats of honor. Two reasons. One is they want everyone to know that they're a guest of honor, but also they want to sit down there so everybody can see them. They will not only have the seat of honor, but everybody there will see that they are in the position of honor. Again, the whole motivation is self. The whole motivation is trying to help, wanting other people to see how important they are. Then he says, and the most important seats in the synagogue. Now, the synagogue would reserve, the officials at the synagogue, their place of worship, they would reserve seats down front, and the honored guests, the honored rabbis, etc., they would be allowed to sit down there. And one of the features of that seat is, if you're sitting down there, you could look and see people, and people could see you. The Pharisees, loved to be seated in those seats because of the honor that suggested that they should have, but also they wanted to sit down there so they could face the crowd and everyone could see how pious they were. Example, they wanted everyone to see that they knew every word to every song, and they sang every word to every song. They wanted everyone to see that they bowed their head and closed their eyes. Now, that ain't what they did back then, but they wanted people to see how much of a participant they were and how pious they were, so that everybody would know how righteous they were. Practice what they say, but don't do what they do. They don't practice what they preach. So they like to have the honored seats at the banquet. They like to have the honored seats in the synagogue. Then he says, they love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace. Now, we talked a little bit about this before, that a greeting involved more than just a handshake, but it involved a loud and a conversation, and they like to be in the marketplace and have other people see that they were well known, that they had lots of friends, that people would come up and greet them and give them, and also, especially, and this is the last part of it, and to be called rabbis by others. When they were in the marketplace and someone came up and with this loud grin, hey, how are you? Good to see you. Oh, Rabbi, how are you? See, the word rabbi, we understand, is associated with the teacher, and the Pharisees would be considered teachers. So they like for people to call them that, because the word rabbi technically means my great one. That is, the folks in that day gave great respect to those who were teachers. So Jesus is saying these people love to be in the marketplace so that crowds will see people coming up to them, greeting them, and calling them my great one, calling them rabbi. Jesus warns them they're doing all of this so that people can see and think more highly of them. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one Father. You are all brothers. And you do not call anyone Father, for you have one Father, and He is in heaven. Don't call anyone rabbi, my great one, the teacher. There's only one teacher, and the teacher is Jesus Christ. You shouldn't call You shouldn't give others that kind of esteem, and likewise, people shouldn't be seeking that kind of esteem because they're seeking equality with God, with Jesus. But there's only one teacher, that's Jesus. There's only one Father, that's God in heaven. And he says we need to be careful how we treat these folks. Listen to what they say, but don't act as they act. Don't do what they do, because they are all acting out of self. They are, in effect, hypocrites. He goes on to say, no, nor are you to call instructors nor are you to be called instructors, for there is one instructor, the Messiah. Then here's the line. The greatest among you will be your servants. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The warning is about hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is playing to be something that you're not. Hypocrisy is when for your own self-benefit, you put yourself out there as something that you're really not. And Jesus is warning about this. He's talking about judging. He's warning about this and talking about following the Pharisees and the scribes. Listen to what they say. Those great principles of the law, they're teaching you. You need to listen to them. But don't act like that act. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't do things out of self. Get beyond self. This is what he's talking about in the Sermon on the Mount in kingdom living. That is, kingdom living is when we are transformed and we get beyond self. Rather, we allow God to live in us and we see other people through His eyes. That makes us loving and accepting. It gets us beyond this judging, etc. And it brings about a humility that is genuinely God-centered. Not a humility like the humped-over Pharisees, but a humility that is genuinely God-centered. Because remember what he said, the greatest in the kingdom are the servants. Jesus came as a servant. The Jews were expecting a conquering warrior. He came as a servant. That is the humility he calls on us to practice. Well, how do we practice humility this week? What do we do when we're tempted to point our finger and criticize and cast judgment on? If someone were to take a tape of your life, someone to take a tape of my life this last week, and they watched all the things I said and did this last week, what would they see? Would they see someone who is out for self? Or would they see that humble servant following the law, reverence for God, respect for other people? That's what Jesus is warning. Beware of hypocrisy. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this lesson. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your promise that it's not up to us in our own human effort to be righteous, but rather you've promised that as we will open ourselves to you and allow you to live in us and through us, your Holy Spirit will transform us. And your Holy Spirit living through us will live your love. Father, this week, give us the eyes to see people as you see them. Enable us to live as Christ-like ambassadors in a world that needs to see Christ.